For my ethnic history class, I decided to do my research project on when exactly I became white. Most of my family, friends, and peers would consider me white by the color of my skin, but that's mostly because I avoid the sun. My brother, who isn't exactly a proponent of sunscreen, is much darker than I am. One might assume he is more ethnic, native, or Mexican than I am. My dad is fairly brown. Many people have assumed he is Indian. On the other hand, my mom is very pasty white and blonde. My brother and I, despite having different shades of skin color, both have red in our beards, which is a telltale sign of Irish ancestry. One might assume that I've always been white since the day I was born. In a way, it's true. I was born with white skin, but what I specifically wanted to cover is when my ancestors started to be considered white. I was gifted an ancestry kit a few years ago and decided to spit in their tube and get my genetics mapped. It's genuinely amazing what a story my saliva enzymes can tell about my long lineage. From talking with my family, I'm understood to be British, Spanish, Mexican, and some Ashkenazi Jewish. Here are the macro identities my ancestry kit reported. History enthusiasts will know what has been considered white in the United States has changed greatly over time. Let's discuss this further. For this final video presentation, I read the book The History of White People by Nell, Irvin, Painter. The majority of the facts in this video will be from the book. According to The History of White People by Irving, what society has considered white was a matter of perspective. Whiteness isn't well defined and varies heavily in different cultures. One might presume it's all about the shade of skin tone, right? Unfortunately, it was never that simple. Races are not a matter of genetic identification, but rather cultural consensus. Race has never been nor will be ever something that is definitive. The definitions and types of races will always change around the society that creates them. Early on in modern society, whiteness was a symbol of beauty. Having pale skin meant you did not have to do physical labor in the sun. White and good-looking slaves fetched a higher price and were used for sex rather than physical labor, or both. In 1894, U.S. anthropologists downplayed anatomical differences rather than defined race by environment and culture. Throughout U.S. history, whiteness was defined by different characteristics. At different times, you could be considered white based on your religion, your head shape, your wealth, and of course, your skin color. At one point, it was stated that long-headed people were more white. Modern definitions of race has mostly to do with skin color, but the many shades of human skin color is just different combinations of melanin. Skin color can change drastically from one generation to the next, especially if your mother and father have different skin colors. Keep in mind that people can share more genetic information with different races than their own. As our previous president Bill Clinton said, we are all mixed race. If you look at our genome, we are 99.5% the same. We spend 99.5% of the time fixating on that last 0.5%. Let's start with my Northwestern European heritage. It's the most uncontested white lineage of mine, although different countries of Northwestern Europe at different times weren't considered white, mainly due to the country's class and wealth. Northwest Europe is comprised of the United Kingdom, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Northern France, Germany, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Iceland, Switzerland, Finland, and Austria. Although the history of the term is complex, most consider this region of the world to be Saxon or Anglo-Saxon. Anglo-Saxon culture has been dominant for a long part of modern history, thus defining themselves as superiorly white. Surprisingly though, not everyone was entirely on board with Northwestern Europe being white. Waldo Emerson, a 19th century American essayist, lecturer, philosopher, abolitionist, didn't believe Swedes or Scandinavians were white. Emerson did eventually admit that Norsemen basically became full Englishmen over his century of life. Although I do not have a lot of French in my lineage, it's worth noting that the French were not considered to be Saxon by some. The book, The History of White People, called attention to Emerson's quote, "To be American was to be Saxon." Now let's talk about my Irish heritage. Irish people, arguably the whitest of us all, weren't always considered white. Irish immigrants started to ship en masse during the Ireland's potato famine crisis that killed 1 million people. Twice as many people migrated to the US seeking food, shelter, and work. During their early immigration, the Irish poor were considered low class. Their Catholic take on Christianity was hugely unpopular. There was a lot of anti-Catholic hysteria at the time. In terms of status, Irish Catholics were considered a notch above slaves. The poor Irish, referred to as white chimpanzees in Ireland, was called a human dog cattle. The previously mentioned Waldo Emerson called the Irish human swine. Around 1910s, Irish Americans started to become more politically active and gain more social capital. At this time, they were the largest voting bloc of immigrants. The Irish were strong proponents of the New Deal since it gave more rights to the working class, which was largely Irish. By 1917, German and Irish immigrants were mostly assimilated into American whiteness. There were new immigrants to tarnish. Slavs, Italians, Jews were the new threats to democracy, according to some. Next, let's discuss my Spanish and Portuguese genetics. The History of White People book didn't write as much about the history of Spanish and Portuguese immigrants, perhaps due to there not being a large wave of immigration all at once like the Irish, Italians, Germans, and Slavs. If you recall from your elementary and middle school history classes, Christopher Columbus was funded by the monarchs of Spain, and the Spanish were early colonizers of North America. In a Cambridge University press paper called The Americas, author R.A. Gomez claimed very few Spaniards had come to the United States directly from Spain. This paper referred to Spaniards as foreign whites. Since there is little focus on immigrating Spaniards and Portuguese, their whiteness status was likely tied to their wealth and class rather than skin color. Their assimilation into the United States must have been more seamless, or they were grouped into other ethnic groups. Next, we'll discuss my Mexican heritage. I'm more familiar with my Mexican and indigenous American lineage. My grandfather and grandmother immigrated to the United States from Mexico and raised my father in Daly City. Whether Mexicans are considered white is still up for debate. Many would not consider Mexican purebloods to be white, but their class and status in the United States has risen over time. In 1948, a popular wartime novel was released with a Mexican protagonist named Julio Martinez. Characters in wartime TV shows showed Mexicans fighting alongside more traditional, white, Saxon actors in the dawn of television. Mexicans being elevated to higher class was more recent, roughly around the 1950s. Popular media played a big part in Mexican assimilation into higher class America. Last but not least, let's talk about my Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. For those who don't know, the term Ashkenazi refers to Jewish settlers who established communities in Western Germany and in northern France during the Middle Ages. My uncle, whose hobbies include mapping his family's histories, told me of a Jewish German relative of mine that escaped Nazi Germany. If you haven't been living under a rock, you'll know the Jews have been persecuted for one reason or another throughout their existence. It's not uncommon to hear about how Jews have allegiance to their homeland Zion and not to where they reside. Calvin Coolidge was interviewed by the hugely popular magazine Good Housekeeping during his 1923 presidency. He warned Americans to be wary of Jewish Americans. In 1850, our favorite lecturer Waldo Emerson considered Jews, Italians, and Greeks to be guano races, who are poor by inherent nature. Yes, he actually compared them to bat poop. During his writings, there wasn't any large waves of immigration of Jews yet. When Jews started to immigrate through Ellis Island in the 20th century, anti-Semitism picked up. Jews were called mean-faced, shifty-eyed, unassimilatable human parasites, according to the history of white people. 60% of Jewish immigrants were deemed morons at Ellis Island through an intelligence test. The criteria for these intelligence tests were quite silly and had no bearing on actual intelligence. Henry Ford, of Ford car fame, was famously anti-Semitic and blamed Jews for labor shortages and union activities. He included anti-Semitic newspapers with his company's popular Model T car. Although by 1900 there were 20 Jewish representatives in the U.S. federal government, they were still considered an outclass in the U.S. around the 1917s. A popular 1908 play titled The Melting Pot had Jewish actors and representation which helped humanize Jewish Americans. By 1945, the first Jewish Miss America was crowned. Despite having pressure to Anglo-Saxonize her name with a pseudonym, she stuck with her true name to celebrate her heritage. So I think it's fair to say Jews had become white between the 1910s and 1950s. As you can see, whiteness and race in general is a strange concept. I hope this information helped contextualize our current political and social problems. If you're looking to learn American history in a welcoming environment, I highly recommend Professor Mustafa Popal at Skyline College. Thanks for watching. Hope you learned something new.